Polly and the Measuring Stick, a story of sticks and snails and marigolds, and one brave little Petunia. Chapter 1. Tickled Pink. Everything was just fine before the Wishakanaba Horticulture Club came to visit. Up until that very day, Polly Petunia had been just plain pleased to be in Mrs. Shumway's garden. You might even say that her rose-colored petals were more of a tickled pink. In the quiet of the mornings, Polly would take a deep breath, turn her leaves up to the sun, and wait for the shimmering rays to come dancing down. Polly loved the times when Whoosh, the gentle wind, would come to visit. He helped her play tag with her friends. She liked to call them her buds. "You're it, Paul," Sally would shout as the tall sunflower tagged the little Petunia with a tip of her firm, broad leaf. Polly would giggle and wait for just the right breeze to whisk her over to Mike Marigold. "Gotcha, bud," she'd shout as she tagged him. Mike would pretend he was angry. "You just wait, you little pansy, you." "Petunia, Mike, I'm a Petunia. I'm Polly Petunia." And she'd laugh because she liked him so well. Sometimes Mrs. Shumway would come to the garden and pinch off some of Polly's shriveled-up old petals. But Polly didn't mind. It made her feel all dressed up. Besides, Mrs. Shumway always bent down to smile when she looked at her. Polly didn't even mind being referee for her two favorite snails, Zip and Zoom, although the job could often be quite stressful. Every afternoon, right before sunset, Zip and Zoom would line up at Polly's stem and beg her to signal the start of their nightly race around the track. The little snails were the most awake when everybody else was fast asleep. "Start the race, Paul," Zip would shout. "Yeah, Paul, start the race," Zoom would echo. And every afternoon Polly would say, "Now, boys, maybe racing isn't such a good—" But they'd have none of Polly's protests and would continue as if they hadn't heard her. "Just stay ready, set, go," they'd shout, and Polly always gave in. "Okay, guys, ready, set, go!" And the little snails would start their night-long marathon around the garden until they appeared back at the foot of Polly's stem at sunrise. "Who won the race this morning, Paul?" one of the little snails would always ask. "Yeah, Paul, who won the race?" the other would chime in. "Measure who's closer, Paul," Zip would shout. "Yeah, Paul, who's closer? Measure!" There really was no way to measure the distance between the two little snails, because always the distance between them was much too tiny to really make a difference at all. But it seemed important to Zip and Zoom. So, choosing her words carefully, Polly would say, "Well, boys, it's close, very close." And she would pick up the crooked twig that lay on the ground beside her, pretending to measure. It was a bumpy old stick and wasn't good for measuring much of anything, but it looked quite official to Zip and Zoom, and they would stretch their antennae when they saw Polly pick it up. Since having a result seemed to be very important to the little snails, Polly dutifully made up a different ruling for them each day. On Monday, she'd say, "I think you were faster than Zip today, Zoom." On Tuesdays, she'd say, "I think you were faster than Zoom today, Zip." And on it went day after day. And all of it seemed to make Polly feel quite useful and just plain happy to be in Mrs. Shumway's garden. Chapter 2. One Particular Thought on One Particular Day. Polly had no reason to feel anything other than her usual tickled pink self on the day the Wishakanaba Horticulture Club came to visit. She was certain that the friends in the Mrs. Shumway's garden circle would smile at her, just as Mrs. Shumway always did. She thought they might even say something about her lovely pink color, or notice how her petals ruffled delicately whenever Whoosh happened to whisk by. She was sure they would love all of her friends in the garden, Danita, Mike, Zach, and Sally. And, as it happened, the little Petunia did hear the Horticulture Club say wonderful things about all of her flower friends. She could hear Mr. Williams praising Mike Marigold.
"Just look at that tough little Marigold, and with all this heat we've been having."
Then Mrs. Burkhover started talking about Danita.
"Doris, I don't think I've ever seen a delphinium that tall, and what an exquisite blue."
And sure enough, it wasn't long before someone with a shaky voice started going on about Lucy.
"My goodness, Doris, your lavender bush has such a lovely fragrance this year. It simply wafts right up on the wind."
Polly waited a very long time through all kinds of oohs for this flower and ahs for that flower. She was certain, however, that soon someone in the garden club would say something wonderful about her. But as the thud of shoes on the ground started to fade to a low, distant rumble, Polly realized the horticulture group had left Mrs. Shumway's garden without saying one sentence, one phrase, one word about her. Not even half a word, the little Petunia sighed. And it was with that particular thought, on that particular day, that all the fun of being in Mrs. Shumway's garden stopped, and all of Polly's worries and wonderings began. Chapter 3. Enter the Measuring Stick. Polly now started to wonder about everything. She started to wonder if she were as dainty as Carrie Corabelle or as kind as Zachary Zinnia. She worried that she wasn't as tall as Danita Delphinium or as fragrant as Lucy Lavender. She even started to wonder if another flower might be a more careful line judge for Zip and Zoom. For more than a whole week, Polly wondered about this and worried about that. She only half-heartedly played tag with Danita and Mike, and only half-heartedly measured the daily winner of Zip and Zoom's marathons around the garden. All Polly could really think about was the one big question that bounced around in her little Petunia head. Why no one from Mrs. Shumway's Horticulture Club had smiled in her direction, or had said anything wonderful about her. Surely I must be taller or pinker or somethinger than someone in this garden, so why, she wondered, why were there no oohs and ahs for me? Polly wanted desperately to find the answer to that question. But how? She asked herself. And then, one morning, just as Polly was picking up the twig to measure Zip and Zoom as they came inching into the finish line, it came to her. "That's it!" she cried out loud. "I've got it! I can just measure to find the answer." As Zip shouted the usual, "Wave us in, Paul!" and Zoom added, "Yeah, Paul! Hooey, wave us in!" Polly leaned down, looked straight into their eager eyes, and said to them quite seriously, "Sorry, boys, not today. I have something very important that I must do." And, clenching the crooked twig in her two strong leaves, Polly turned away from the little snails and began measuring everything that old stick could reach. Chapter 4. The Frenzied Quest. First, Polly started measuring Danita Delphinium's height, and then she measured her own. Danita was taller, a lot taller. About 1,000 feet taller, Polly estimated. Polly forgot that delphiniums were made to be tall to attract butterflies and hummingbirds. Next, Polly tried to measure Carrie Corabelle's beauty, and then she tried to measure her own. "It's very hard to measure beauty," she thought, "but I think Carrie has more. About 352 times more," she guessed. The little Petunia forgot that beauty comes from simply being a good soul in the world. By nightfall, Polly was exhausted from all her measuring and calculating and fell into a restless sleep. She awoke early the next morning only to begin again. Polly measured this flower and that flower, always comparing the best of each one of them with the part she thought worst in herself. She never played tag any more, and she never had time to say even, "Hey," to Zip and Zoom. Chapter 5. Down to the Ground. Instead of making Polly feel better, all of the measuring was causing the little Petunia to feel quite exhausted, lonelier than she had ever been, and terribly, terribly weak. Polly now had trouble just holding up her once strong stem. Zip and Zoom were so worried that they stopped their marathons around the garden. Mike and Danita missed playing tag with their very best friend. Everyone in the garden was concerned. Even Polly herself became afraid of what might happen to her. But still she clutched the old stick, and still she looked for something else to measure. Chapter 6. The Saving Thumps. It wasn't long before the little Petunia had grown so weak that she lay flat on the ground, unable to lift her petunia head. All Polly could do now was listen to the sounds of Mrs. Shumway's garden. She could hear the rustle of butterfly wings and the twittering of ladybugs as they visited all her friends. She could hear the bustling of all the ants who scurried past her. She could hear last night's rain as it ran through well-worn tunnels beneath her roots. Soon, however, Polly became so weak that even these sounds faded until all she could hear was the labored beating of her own little petunia heart. Thump, thumpity-thump, thump, thumpity-thump. At first the rhythm soothed Polly, but the weaker she became, the fainter the thumps became. Thump, thump. The beats were all slushy now, and somehow seemed to blend together with the last few words that remained inside the little Petunia's head. Petunia, Mike, I'm a... Polly tried to repeat the words out loud so at least they wouldn't stop. I'm Polly, to thumpa. Thought Polly, wondering at what she had heard, so she spoke again. I'm Polly Petunia, to thumpa to thump. Polly couldn't believe what she was hearing. It was as if the thumps were making the words she was saying, and Polly tried to think of more. The harder she tried, however, the more the little Petunia could feel the old stick pressing against her petals and stem. Angry that she had ever picked it up in the first place, she tried to push it away, but her shriveled leaves seemed locked around it. Let go, Polly shouted. Stop it, she cried. Polly tried to press her petals closer to the ground to hear another thump, but the old stick was in the way, still pushing against her. Stop it, she shouted again and tried to force the stick away. It wouldn't budge. Finally, with fire in her eyes and with every last ounce of energy that was left within her, Polly raised her stem and leaves up as far as they could go, and with one great she flung that crooked old stick as far from her as she could. It landed close to her stem, but far enough to be out of reach. Whew, she sighed. That's much better. Now she could listen to the thumps. The sounds were much louder now, and suddenly Polly was hopeful. She lay in the soil for a long time, just listening to the beating of her petunia heart. With each new rhythm, she felt stronger, and soon she even started humming along. I'm Polly Petunia, to thumpa to thump. There's only one me, to thumpa to thump. Zip and Zoom, being closest to the ground, were the first to hear their little friend. The sing-song sweetness of Polly's voice whistled through their raised antenna. Sing louder, Paul, encouraged Zip. Yeah, Paul, sing real loud, assessed Zoom. Polly cleared her little petunia throat, and for her two favorite snails she started again. I am what I am, and I know what I know. Zip and Zoom clapped their antennae in delight. Polly glanced at the crooked old stick that lay on the ground not far away and quickly added, And I don't need to measure to see how I grow. Soon all the flowers in Mrs. Shumway's garden started to notice the singing and turned their direction towards Polly. Sing more, Paul, added Sidney. Yeah, Polly, sing more, echoed Mike. You little pansy, you. Petunia, Mike. I'm a petunia. And Polly laughed for the first time in a very long time. As Polly kept singing, she could almost feel her stem straightening. Her leaves were opening wider, and somehow they felt greener. Polly sang all that day until the sun had started to set in Mrs. Shumway's garden. The next day Polly sang, and the day after that, and the day after that. And every time Polly reached to pick up the stick and start measuring, she stopped and started thinking about new words for her song. I look where I've been, and I'm proud where I am. Then I look straight ahead and just follow my plan. With each new verse, the little petunia seemed to be stronger and to grow more. Soon she was adding more shoots and leaves and buds than she ever had before. Polly was growing all over Mrs. Shumway's garden. Zip and Zoom had trouble just keeping up. Polly's song now echoed each day throughout the garden. Soon the whole garden started singing along, each with their own words and their own rhythm. Chapter 7. The Return. And so it went throughout the whole garden. Mrs. Shumway's flowers were growing and singing and growing, higher and thicker and farther than they had ever grown before. And sure enough, there came a day when the Wishakanaba Horticulture Club returned.
Stand up nice and tall,
Polly whispered to all her friends. As Polly saw the garden club come closer and closer, she felt as if her heart might leap right out of her little petunia chest. For although Polly had put down the measuring stick a long time ago, it was hard not to listen for words that the garden club might be saying. As Polly listened, she could indeed hear oohs for Danita and ahs for Mike Marigold, and still she heard no oohs or ahs for her. But that's okay, the strong petunia reassured herself.
This might be the perfect time, she thought, to sing the song that helped me to grow all the new leaves and buds and blooms that I am so proud of.
Just as Polly was beginning to start her song, she felt a great that seemed to almost suck the air right out of the garden. As Polly looked up, she could see Mrs. Shumway grasp her heart and breathe another Suddenly, Mrs. Shumway's shoes started running away from the garden straight towards the Shumway house. The screen door slammed as Mrs. Shumway ran into her house and slammed again as she ran out. Suddenly, Polly could feel Mrs. Shumway standing closer to her than she had ever been before. There was something silver and shiny in Mrs. Shumway's hands, and Polly was frightened until she could hear the sounds. They were cute little clicks the petunia had never heard before, and Polly saw light flashing again and again right into her own shining petunia eyes.
"She's taking your picture, Polly!" shouted Danita across the garden. "Smile!"
When the clicking had stopped, Polly heard Mrs. Shumway's voice. It was very high and seemed almost out of breath. "I simply can't believe my eyes," she said. "My little petunia, way over here! So many leaves and buds and blooms, and such a bright, rosy pink, more lovely than I could have ever imagined, more beautiful than I could have ever planned. Oh, how did this happen?" Polly knew, and so did all of Polly's flower friends. Zip and Zoom high-fived each other, and Whoosh breezed in just in time to help Mike lean over to Polly and whisper, "Nice going, you little pansy, you."
"Petunia, Mike. I'm a petunia,"
laughed Polly. She smiled over to Danita and all her other buds, gave a wink to Zip and Zoom, and felt just plain pleased once again to be in Mrs. Shumway's garden. You might even say she was tickled pink.